Ladies and gentlemen, señoras y señores, boa tarde, good afternoon. Ah, ecco, Federico Moretti. Allora comincia lei? Sì, sì. No, possiamo anche parlare italiano, non si preoccupi. Allora comincia lei e poi il signor Scialdone, poi você, Mariana, que vai falar por la Maria Luisa. E depois fala você. Bueno, tá bom. Okay, we are now starting our session on 4, Identity and Religion, Patterns of Collective Belonging. There's no better place in the world to talk about religion than this. I mean, we are in the face of a pilgrimage center, I mean, the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. I will make an extremely short introduction of each speaker. And since we have quite an intensive session, and I'm warning, I'm going to be extremely restrictive. Each speaker will have at disposal 15 minutes, and I will be merciless. So I will simply interrupt you and say, please come to the end, because otherwise our schedule couldn't be put through. So let's begin with Mrs. Federica Moretti from the Catholic University Leuven, who's going to talk about new regulations and feelings, houses, returns, disappointment. The floor is yours.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. And, okay. And a special thank you, of course, to Emilia and the other organizer of this year IME conference for hosting us in this mystical city of Santiago. What I would like to share with you this afternoon is the research that I've been doing in the past months within a project on all the new Italian migration. It is a multi-sided project taking simultaneously place in France, Great Britain, Germany, and in Switzerland, where I'm currently based. Indeed, in the past months, I've been working with the Italians of the first generation in the canton of Bern and Geneva. And here, throughout this work, I could not but notice the possibility to develop a research on the peculiarities who are currently driving the discourses of the Italian migrants. Indeed, a recent bilateral agreement dating back in 2010 is causing new emotional distress among these Italians with whom I've been working with, and who are now retired or approaching their retirement age. And therefore people in their 60s living in Switzerland since decades. What I told to structure the presentation in 2 parts. I will first give an overview of the immigration in Switzerland, then I will locate the research, and finally provide a few outcomes that are not final, because these discourses are still going on, because it's a really recent matter. The immigration in Switzerland actually can be dated back in the 19th century, and especially starting in 1888, when the census. Okay, I'm nervous, so I'm speaking low. Like in 1888 census, the data shows for the first time in the recent history of Switzerland that the country switched from an immigration country to an immigration country, and several factors, of course, driven this switching, and there were mainly urbanization, industrialization, infrastructural development, but also residence agreements stipulated between the Swiss Confederation and neighborhood country, first with Italy, then France, Germany, and to a lesser extent also Austria, in order to facilitate the in-commerce of foreign workers needed in the Swiss economy. Then in the 20th century, the 20th century is characterized by a peculiar tendency, because in the first half, the Swiss Confederation witnessed a decrease of immigration due to structural factors such as economic crisis, as of course the wars. But the second half, because of reconstruction, but also because of the refugees crisis, and mostly because of the revolution in the Balkans area, the immigration in Switzerland started again to increase, as we can see from this graphic. Then the 21st century has, of course, an increase again of the immigration process, but in this case, there is a different shape of the immigrants, because there are not more guest workers as it was in the past, but there are now cross-border workers, and more recently young professionals who are mainly from Italy, North Italy, and then Germany. And according to depending on the cantons where they are moving, they are localized in different market sections. For example, in Geneva, they are in international organizations. In the region where I've been working, that is driven by communicative infrastructure and watch industry, there are high specialized professionals in communication technologies and also design for the watch industry. So according to the last data of the Bundesamt für Statistik, dating back to last year, December, on a total population of 8 million people, more than 6 million are Swiss nationals, whereas more than 2 million are not Swiss nationals. Of course, these data are not taken into consideration, for example, within the Swiss national, all those people with foreign origins who already have Swiss nationality. And in the 2 million, there are not, for example, the Italians who are living in Switzerland since decades, and therefore they hold a long permit of stay, but they are not Swiss nationals. So these data are not really accounting for the foreign origins of the Swiss population. And the majority of the foreign population holds a UE or EFTA nationality. And the first national group is with more than 15% of the population, and followed by Germans and Portuguese. So now a few notes on the Italians in Switzerland. They started, let's say, to arrive after the unification, Italian unification, so 1860. And by the beginning of the 20th century, they already constituted 37% of the total foreign population. And until 1960, this Italian population was characterized by a peculiar regional origin. Namely, they came from the northern regions of Piemonte, Lombardia, Veneto, and Friuli. And that's all true until the 1960s, when we witnessed a switching from the origins. Instead, from the north, the driven regions were that of south of Sicily, Calabria, Puglia, and Campania. And this is just a note of Russo, who's a reporter of an Italian newspaper, who in 1964 wrote a book mentioning that the Southern dialect was the main language spoken in Switzerland, in order to account the quantity of the Italians living there at that time. And the peak of the Italian population in Switzerland was reached in 1975, when the Italians constituted 2/3 of the total foreign population. From the second half of the 70s, however, the Italian immigration towards Switzerland started to decrease because of economic factors that started to be in Italy, like the economic boom. But it never really stopped. As I was saying before, there was just different shape of this movement, namely cross-border workers and young specialized professionals. And in fact, in 2010, the AIRE, the register mentioned this morning, counted for more than 500,000 of Italian citizens living in Switzerland. So, of course, because of the quantity of the Italians living in Switzerland, there were the basis to develop a strong associationism. And this is the picture, for example, of the Italian Mutual Aid Society based in Lausanne, from the last years of the 19th century. And this is a special kind of associationism, especially developed really in the period after the unification until the beginning of the 20th century, not only in Italy, but in also the states where the welfare state was basically non-existing. So it was a sort for, especially for workers, to get help in their immigration country. So besides this mutual aid society, of course, the church played a fundamental role in helping the community abroad, and was developed, of course, to help the workers, but also for the church itself, in order to prevent a decrease of Catholic people, because those, for example, the Italians were in Germany or in Switzerland or in Belgium, and other countries that were Protestant at that time. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, we witnessed a development of new sort of associations. And for example, in 1943, in Switzerland, was established these free Italian colonies that was made by people who fled the Mussolinian regime. And so at the beginning, they started to be political and intellectual association, but then they also start to interact with the workers in order to provide assistance to them. And they were also the first who started to notice the possibility that after the Second World War, the Italian immigration in Switzerland would have increased again. Then in 1955, the trade unions and political parties started to realize that maybe it was time to activate themselves to prevent the hegemony of the church in the sustainment of the migrants. And so in 1950, when the main trade union in Italy split, there were the establishment of three main trade unions who are still now operating, inspired by Catholic ideologies, sociologist socialist ideologies, and communist ideologies. And of course, in this period also, the church still played a fundamental role. But then in the 1960s and 1970s, especially in the 1970s, when the Italian regions were founded, when established in Italy, there is an emergence of a new sort of associationism based on local and regional origins. And because of the peculiarity of the condition that the Italian workers were experiencing in Switzerland, the social network that they established were the strongest and well-developed in Europe, accounting for more than 1,000 organizations in all the Swiss Confederation. That is quite a huge number considering the dimension of the Swiss Confederation. So we can now move to the second part. So provide some notes on the research field, and the red arrow shows where I've been located. This is in the Bern canton, and this city has some peculiarity who made a very interesting site where to locate a research on migration. In fact, geographically, it is located in a German-speaking canton, but is the biggest bilingual French-German city in all Switzerland. Then, economically speaking, already in the 19th century, it started to be an interesting pole where to go for work, because it has a well-developed economy for infrastructure, construction, automotive. In fact, the General Motors Swiss was based in Bienne, and then more recently also watch and communication district. And demographically is also interesting because it has more than 55,000 inhabitants, and 31% of these holds a non-Swiss nationality. And the Italians account for the 20% of the total amount of the foreign population living there. And also the 10% of all the Italians living in the consular district of Bern are residing in the city of Vienna. And the Italian population in Vienna reached its peak after the Second World War, and especially between 1965 and 1969, when more than 30,000 Italian people were living in Vienna. And then it decreased, and in 1975 there were more than 6,000, and now there are half of them, so more than 3,000. So there are here two graphics to show the relevance that the Italian community, and the numbers especially, represents for the city of Vienna. And for example, in 1974, there were the 66.5% of the total foreign population. And of course, for the whole Switzerland, also in Vienna, the associationism was a relevant part of the Italian life that here can be defined as a real community, not as was saying before this morning, for example, in Germany and in Morocco, that Italians now, they don't constitute a community. They were and they are still a community in Switzerland and in Vienna especially. And the first association that we have traced is the Brotherhood Society from 1926, whose motto was giving, helping, comforting, friendship, and solidarity. And their role was mainly assistential, but not only material assistential, but mostly an emotive support to help the migrants to have a common space where to share free time and emotion and perspective also for the futures. And in the 60s, they increased their activities and developed some social cultural activities in order to maintain also the ties with the country of origin. Then in 1947, the Italian Catholic Mission was established also in Vienna, and it covered three main roles, of course, religious activities, but also assistance, like they were mediating with the employers, they were explaining the workers, the contracts, and they also sent back the remittances.
1 minute.
Okay, then I will switch. They also established school, like the kindergartens and the primary school. And then in the 1960s and the 1970s, a new association based on local and regional origins developed, like the Sicilian or Abruzzesi, but also we had music bands and veterans from the First World War. So the third part, that was actually maybe the most interesting, but I lost my time. So it's the interplay between the normative decision and the emotional tension, who started to taking place since 2010 when this bilateral agreement was signed between the Swiss Confederation and Italy. And it's an agreement to find the so-called tax evaders who are living in Switzerland or in Italy and holding goods like money or bank account of houses in another country. And the Swiss authority allow for the population, for the people who are having goods in another country to self-declare themselves. But what is, like, how many time I have? 30 seconds. Okay, then. Yeah,
please come to.
Sorry. So what is interesting is that this agreement is actually developing and giving a new space for discursive practices who were once very spread among the Italian community, that is that of returning home. And now there are again these returnees' desire due to an interplay between the internal world, so that the emotions and the fact that there will always be Italy will be always home, but also the normative aspect of this bilateral agreement, who are like kind of forcing people to start again with these discourses. And yeah, sorry, I wanted to say differently, but
okay, thank you very much,
you.
Ms. Moretti. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you Mr. Antonello Scialdone from East Fall Department of Welfare in Rome, who's going to talk about on Cossack legacy and matriarchs in exile, linking nation-building process and rhetorics of womanhood in Ukrainian diaspora. So, Mr. Scialdone, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks for being here. Thanks to Emilia for perfect organization. I'm a big fan for our chair, but I cannot avoid to spend some seconds of my time to give you two warnings, two caveats. The first one is concerning my institution. ISPOL is a public research institution which belongs to Italian government means National Institute for Vocational Training of Workers, but in a month you couldn't find me in the email address you will find in the last slide, because we are changing our names. We will become INAP, which means National Institute for Analysis of Public Policy. The second wording, which could be a little more relevant than this one, is I do not consider myself a specialist of Ukrainian affairs. I deal with migratory issues and social policy themes, but starting analyzing caregiving workers and labor market in Italy, you maybe know that social organization of Italian family depends on a lot of badanti coming from Eastern Europe. I started to study Ukraine, and I think that it's really interesting for our interest to go on and get together some suggestions which come from ethnographic fieldwork, political science, and social analysis. The first suggestions come from the name. Ukraine in Slavic, ancient Slavic words, means borderland, because it depends on a root which means the limit, the edge. And near, so the name of the country means near the edge, upon the edge. Another source suggests that we could consider the relevance of a verb which means to cut, and so the meaning of Ukraine becomes a piece that is cut. I think that it's interesting for all the things that we shall see together. Ukraine has been written recently, remains Europe's terra malecognita. Even if it is geographically at the center of our continent, in the middle between Europe and Atlantic, is a land which has had a lot of opposite situation, and has not been considered as it must. Samuel Huntington talked about a cleft country, a divided nation, a nowhere nation, the unsuspected nation. Actually, Ukraine, which is Europe's second largest country, has the male population, I beg your pardon, with lowest life expectancy in Europe, is the main supplier of migrant labor to Europe, and the major sending country of irregular migrant workers, as according to the International Organization for Migrants, the largest number of victims of trafficking in the world. History of nation is really difficult to describe. It gained independence 25 years ago, exactly 25 years ago, but maybe is one of the most difficult example of post-Soviet transitions. Exceptionally distressing. Some things that we could talk about a sort of a Matryoshka model, because the history and geography of this country belongs to several nested histories and geographies, taking part of Augsburg Empire and Ottoman Empire and Tsarist Empire, having had a long existence, which actually incites in the fragmentation of Ukrainian identity. You surely know that there are a lot of ethnic divisions, the one which actually are going on provoking a war, which we have forgotten. But what is interesting is that actually many Ukrainians prefer to be identified as Tuteshny, which is a Ukrainian word, which suggests that the primary identification is with their locality rather than with the state. So the thing we have to consider is the lack of social trust and a national identification. We have also to consider the Russian factor. There's been a strong debate during last 25 years concerning the common inheritance by semi-mythical, middle-aged principality, the Kievan Rus. Both Russian historians and Ukrainian historians pretended that that roots were the basis for the national identity. I mean, the Ukrainian one and the Russian one. Russia has been considered as by political scientists as the Ukraine's constituting other, and we could see that in representation of gendered migration, something about Russian models does work. During this period of independence, there have been various attempts to root in mass consciousness a set of primordial myths about Ukraine. Myths coming from religion, come from invented histories. And there's been a sort of meeting of nationalist agendas with intellectual circles pretending to discover 1,000 years of history, pretending to tell that the Scythian language was the oldest in Europe and the Trypillian, an archaeological invention, was the basis of Europe. And the Orient civilization of the Dnieper River was the basis of European civilization. What I want to tell you that there's been a lot of narratives aimed to create shared meanings of belonging, memory, morality, but haven't been able to create a common past, the consciousness of a common past. Let's go in the middle of the theme, the gender roles. As you can see, on the left, there's a poster which comes from Soviet times. And in Soviet times, women had not to stay at home. They had to work. They were independent as a reaction to Soviet image of the women. Ukrainian nationalism has been devoted only to the celebration of a semi-mythical figure, the Berhenia, which is the one which stays high on the right, sort of a pagan goddess, which is supposed to be the mother of the nation, the one which protects the interest of the family and gives courage to the nation. It's a symbol for the unity of the nation. The other side, according to some feminist scholars, is the Barbie model, the doll-like model. For what concerns males, the patriarchal renaissance, which has started up after the nationalist agendas, has been identified with the Cossack revival, a militaristic community which embodies a range of virtues: independence, devotion to principles, courage. And there's an interesting anecdote concerning the noble Cossack called Pavlo Polubotok, which died in prison in St. Petersburg, which was so a victim of the Tsarist. Yeah, it was supposed to have left in the Bank of England a treasure for Ukrainian nation. This was a mass question during 1990. Yeah, there was a legend about the chance for each Ukrainian citizen to get a part of this treasure, approximately 38 kilos of gold. Barrels were never found. There was a diplomatic mission to go to the Bank of England, and it was substituted in public opinion by the legacy of glorious national past and love of native land. Now we come to our days. Actually, Ukraine has the GDP lower than any European country except Albania and Moldova. It was actually is 1/3 of GDP of Poland GDP. 25 years was exactly the same. Shadow economy is estimated near 50%, widening inequalities. 7 out of 10 people stay below poverty line and is often associated with the presence of children. Average salary is approximately $130 per month, which means exactly comparing with the destination country of Ukrainian migrants, it is 8, 10, 15 times the sum which refers to the salary in Ukraine. So employment can provide a solid pathway out of material deprivation. The areas more interested by the migration are the rural ones. Almost 70% of households have some family members which has gone abroad. You can see there's a problem of depopulation in Ukraine, and migration works selectively in this scenario because the ones who leave are the mostly active and well-skilled. This is the last wave of the diaspora, which started at the end of 19th century. Actually, Ukrainians are in Brazil, in Canada, in the States, and in the last wave, all over Europe, especially in Russia, in Poland, Italy, Czech Republic, and Spain. Most widespread is circular migration, but also long-term mobility is increasing. Every year, almost 1 million of Ukrainians are granted short-term visas to Schengen countries, but majority of flows is illegal. 70% of flows aren't absolutely registered. Immigration has become the main time of occupation of way of life. So the main reason to go abroad is getting a job, and the negative perception of quality of life, and endemic corruption too. We have no time to deal with this theme, but it's really interesting. And the hybrid war with Russia, which is going on from 2 years, has had a huge effect on the quality of economy, as you can see, but also on the growth of internal displaced person. And in any case, experts forecast new big exodus when the current conflicts end. Side effects of migration could be the family disintegration. Ukraine, and especially nationalistic parties, have stressed the problem of Euro orphans or social orphans, children left behind. And especially migrant women, which are playing a prominent role in the current flows, especially the ones which go towards Southern Europe, have been often stigmatized for their choice to leave, because their absence disrupt the unity of the family and the nation. Remember, or the Berehenia symbol. The problem with the children left behind is the commodification of relationship with parents, but also the risk of bad behavior, dropping out of school, alcohol.
You have 1 minute.
Okay. Another problem is the men in distress, male suicides, 20% alcohol abuse, but we don't mind males here, me, in this situation. That's interesting. Going to some trigger points, need to recontextualize women's roles, reconsidering simplified images of victims of transitions, not only of scenario loss, but also of achievements, as we will see for what concerns remittances. Post-Soviet Ukraine has been constituted transnationally, but the issues is completely neglected by the political agenda. No agency, no migration policy, no law which could help children left behind. So transnational parenting remains a private affair. Look at this data about remittances. You can consider it on this data that the Ukrainian economy depends on remittances, which come from migrant women. And so we could say that there's been a mutual constitution of migration and nation achieved through the manipulation of gendered relations. If you want to be able to rewrite and reassess the current situation of this country, maybe we are in need of more nuanced inquiry, and we can also tell that we could only benefit from abandoning nationalist paradigm. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, next paper, or next speaker was announced Mrs. Maria Luisa Di Martino from the University of Deusto in the Basque Country. However, Maria Luisa Di Martino is not there. She was unable to join us. However, her paper is there, and her paper will be presented by her colleague, Mariana dos Santos Parra. Please, the floor is yours.
É melhor sentar aí. So, good afternoon. I'm going to present on behalf of my colleague, who couldn't come for personal reasons, personal problems. So, the presentation is about a highly skilled migrant woman in the Basque Country, Reconstruction of Identities. This research is part of a PhD thesis, her PhD thesis in progress, based on a study of the intersection between professional and personal migratory projects in highly skilled migrant women in the context of the Basque Country. So the objective of this research, the main aim of the research is to analyze the career paths of highly skilled migrant women through three main levels of analysis: micro, meso, and macro. In order to understand which are the reasons for migration and which are the strategies of labor integration. In which sectors are they working? What are the opportunities in the Basque labor market? And how did they achieve a matching of educational level versus occupation? How does the professional path influence the personal identity and reconstruction? The personal identity reconstruction. Corresponding to these research questions, it could be said that there are three levels of analysis. The micro level corresponds to the social psychological factors, reasons for migration, strategies, aspirations, roles, expectations. The macro level corresponds to the structure of the labor market, constructed as segmentation of opportunities. And the meso level corresponds to the relational plan, individual and collective processes, process and dynamics. The link between highly qualified migration and women. So, on conceptual framework, for the conceptual framework, we take into account that there are two dimensions in the study of migration projects linked to career. Career as objective dimension, it is a sequence of job positions which lead to a change of status in the life course of highly skilled migrant women. It is not yet a linear path, but it can be upward or downward. It can be orderly or chaotic. On career as subjective dimension, it has implicit the concept of opportunities for the development. In this dimension, indeed, the identity is subject to a deconstruction and reconstruction process. We are in front of multiple subjects in constant transformation, in contact with the external world, and in the collective identity of the home and host country. Another important idea is the reconstruction of identity. The idea of the reconstruction of identity with the professional path is included in the sociology of labor and professions, where the link between career and identity was analyzed in this intersection of social representations of professions. In other words, this research claims that identity is linked to the construction of the self-image as representation of the activity developed, corresponding therefore to a specific social role within the social structure and institutions. And it is constructed both socially and individually. On the methodological strategy adopted, since the migratory trajectory is constructed as a sequence of steps in life course of a migrant person between origin and host country, the life course perspective is applied as it allows analyzing the dynamics between structure and agency in a retrospective way. Considering individuals' participation in different domains of the existence through their working lives, establishing milestones and social rules in relation to the individual's characteristics matched into the social structure and the historical change, according to Bermudez. A qualitative method was applied and 26 semi-structured in-depth interviews carried out. The selection criteria were highly skilled migrant woman, aging between 28 and 60 years old, resident of the Basque Country. The criteria for the definition of high-skilled migrant woman were the following. For the level of education, it is based on the International Standards Classification of Education of UNESCO. For the level of occupation, it is based on the International Standards Classification of Occupations of ILO, taking into account consideration of occupations of managers, middle-level manager, specialists and technicians, intellectual workers, engineers, health and psychology, musicians, and administrative staff. They were selected from different origins and combined in two main groups, Latin Americans and Europeans, as they are dominant in relation to the highly skilled occupations for gender in the Basque Country. Finally, the objective is to compare them in order to visualize if there are elements of subordination or differentiation related to the origins. However, due to a limitation of time, we will not deepen into this objective in this presentation. As we can see from the data of the Basque Country survey of foreign-born immigrants by origin and sectors of occupation, foreign women from Western European Union in the Basque Country are 45%, Oriental European Union are 12%, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay are 20%, Brazil, Venezuela, and Dominican Republic are 7%, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador are 4%. And some data about the sectors of occupation of the Basque Country survey of foreign-born immigrant populations showed that from 2010 to 2014, the number of migrant women in highly skilled sectors has grown, especially managerial sector, experts and middle-level managers, and administrative staff. Finally, some provisional findings. Some typologies and patterns in their profiles were recognized. These typologies are theoretical
and they have not the pretension of substitute quantitative representations, but they want to open the path to new researches on this way. About the construction of typologies based on the migratory process and based on the reasons for migration, their expectations, aspirations, and ambitions. So we can say that there are 7 different kinds of typologies divided as follows. Highly skilled migrant women who come for educational process, the ones who come for working process, the ones who come for sentimental process, women following their husbands, women following their families of origin, and mixed process, study, work, as possible case of brain circulation. And finally, there is a common transversal process, which I have called transformative process, which she has called transformative process. Because they start from one typology, but they change their motivations, aspirations, expectations during the migratory project because of internal or external factors. Consequently, they change their professional paths according to their new personal experiences. It indicates that the change of identity in the migration process has an impact on the career and vice versa. Another finding is that there is a matching of education versus occupation. However, there were bridge jobs in some experiences, which helped them to study or conclude the educational level that could allow them to work in a matching situation. So some patterns, 3 main patterns were distinguished based mostly on the reasons for starting the migration project. They referred to the first approach to the Basque Country labor market. The first pattern is direct pattern, job, education, improvement of the lifestyle, sentimental reasons. The second pattern is indirect pattern, brain circulation, Erasmus experience, accompanying husbands or family of origin. And the third pattern is transversal pattern or circulatory pattern. These 3 patterns are linked among them, and they have a circulatory movement. This demonstrates again that the motivations, aspirations, expectations, ambitions of these women change in their life course for several internal or external elements, which modify their professional path and professional priorities. Therefore, a highly skilled migrant woman can cross several patterns, career change, and they are subject to a continuous redefinition of identity. Well, on some final remarks, in both cases of Latin American and European highly skilled migrant woman, she could identify 2 main kinds of professional paths in the case of women interviewed, orderly career and wavy career. Orderly career is according to Spillerman, and wavy career according to Maria Luisa. Orderly career correspond to labor positions with progressively change of income and status. In the case of highly skilled migrant women, the construction of professional position is achieved in similar branch of competence activity. Wavy career corresponds to no progressivity in labor circulation between sectors and levels of education, but it consists in a circulation among several countries, circulation among different contracts and jobs, the most of the time in precarious conditions. These 2 patterns correspond to the predetermination of a migration strategy. In the case of women who have a pre-migration or post-migration strategy, actually, the labor trajectory seems to be more steady and orderly. By contrast, in the case of the lack of strategy, the main result seems to be a wavy career with a lot of bridge job, used to step to their major dreams or aspirations in relation to career and labor market access and integration. On external elements, macro and meso level, an external factor is reaching the validation of the same educational level. When it is not possible, they have a clearer strategy to work in jobs which belong to the same branch of expertise, so they do not fall down in overqualification except for brief periods of time. Another external reason is sentimental. It is one of the most important elements to take into account for this analysis. Indeed, migrant women's couple is Basque in the majority of the cases, without difference between Latin Americans and European women. To support of the management group, as well as the support of institutional umbrella, helps to establish orderly and steadier careers. On internal elements, micro level, as internal element to stress, there is the ambition as one of the common driving force of starting and reaching a steady migratory career. The reconstruction of identity is a clear element in the adaptation process. In the case of the labor integration, the process is more steady in the case of orderly career, and more unstable and shifty in the case of wavy and more precarious career. The change of professional paths towards areas of education, competences correlated with the original professional identity helps to a steadier integration into the labor market. For orderly careers, the change of occupation is horizontal in the most of the time, not upper, not lower, but in a similar branch of the original professional identity. Well, some limitations, there is a, can I just, okay.
50 seconds.
50, well, all right. Yeah, there's just a comment on the case of the medical sector, which is reserved to the Euskera-speaking natives. So, thank you for your attention. Marisa said sorry for the inconvenience for her absence, and my colleague is open to answer any questions by email if anyone is interested.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have Mrs. Ines Otsina-Smith from the Latvian Documentation Center and Archive, the UK. I was just gonna give a paper on documenting the history and cultural identity of the Latvian diaspora in Brazil. So please, floor is yours. You have 15 minutes time, like everyone else.
Yeah. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I also thank the AEMI for accepting this paper about the Latvian diaspora in Brazil. I have been a migrant almost all my life, so I feel with this conference. The combination of the words Latvian and diaspora is a fairly new phenomenon. It started to be used by researchers in Latvia in the late 1990s as a term to describe the combination of new immigrants after renewal of Latvian independence in 1991 and the so-called exile Latvians and their descendants who fled Latvia towards the end of World War II. What many people don't realize is that there were migrations of Latvians as long ago as the 19th century, most notably to Tsarist Russia, the US, Australia, and Brazil, hence this diagram. In a fascinating book by Vilberts Krasnais called Latvian Colonies, first published in 1938, he tells how, and I quote, "In 1899, two Latvians traveled around Brazil, and on returning to Latvia, they published colorful articles about their experiences. And in 1890, they published a book about Brazil, particularly describing southern Brazil. Influenced by this book, in April 1890, 25 Latvian families left Riga by ship, bound for the state of Santa Catarina in Brazil, full of high hopes for establishing the first Latvian settlement at Rio Novo. End quote. In the years that followed, more Latvians settled in the state of Santa Catarina and also in Ijuí in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. By 1906, there were also Latvian colonies in Nova Odessa, Corumbata, and Nova Europa in the state of São Paulo. The settlement of Varpa, founded by the Baptists, minister Jānis Enķis in 1922, so we've jumped forward, was a different matter. This was the first mass migration of Latvians because Enķis had about 2,000 followers. Nowadays, you might call this a cult. But they were Baptists. They had been promised that there would be a quote, mass ascension to heaven in 1924, and the chosen ones would reach God more quickly. There is even a painting in the Latvian Museum in Varpa that depicts the faithful waiting for the ascension, which unfortunately didn't happen. You might wonder why so many Baptists emigrated. Though not the case in 1922, when Latvia was an independent country prior to World War I, previously Baptists had suffered considerable persecution under the government of the Russian Orthodox Tsar. Towards the end of World War II, by October 1944, about 200,000 Latvians had fled from the advancing Soviet army, and most ended up in displaced persons camps in Germany. From there, by 1950, most had migrated further to what would be their countries of residence from then on. Many of those who came to Brazil re-emigrated to Canada and the US in the 1950s and 1960s. After almost 50 years of occupation by the Soviet Union, Latvia is now independent again, but things did not work out as quickly or as well as expected. By the mid-1990s, the worldwide economic crisis begins and optimism turns to disillusionment. People start emigrating again, mostly to the UK and North America, but they came to Brazil as well. It is estimated that there are now about 100,000 Latvians living in the UK. According to Krasnais, in 1935, there were an estimated 300,000 Latvians living abroad in about 60 countries. Today, according to the Latvian Office of Citizenship and Migration Affairs, the same number, 300,000, are living in about 120 countries. By 2016, there have now been 5 migrations from Latvia to Brazil, spanning 116 years and almost 5 generations. It is estimated that assimilation into the host country's society is probable by the 3rd generation. So how have the Latvians in Brazil managed to maintain their ethnic identity? I must stress here that what I am going to say is not based on systematic scientific research, but on observation, conversation, and reading. What I consider as contributing to ethnic identity is based mostly on what UNESCO defines as intangible cultural heritage, under which come language, rituals, community activities such as song festivals, and also what used to be called non-material cultural heritage. The tangible cultural heritage, previously material, is easier to identify because it concerns things you see and touch, such as monuments, memory institutions such as libraries and so on, and their contents. As everywhere, Latvians in Brazil did organize themselves, though maybe not quite as comprehensively as those in the Northern Hemisphere. Much of the society revolved around worship and church activities, particularly where the Baptists were concerned. Being good Christian Baptists came first. Being Latvian came second. Let's look at how the pioneer Latvians lived, starting with a visit to Varpa. In a good car on a good highway, it takes 6 hours from Nova Odessa to Varpa, which is up in the northwestern corner of São Paulo state. One can only imagine what it was like to have to chop your way through the rainforest to reach this distant place. It took them months, and many people died on the way. Where did I? Right, thank you. On the way to Varpa, there were no jungles or rainforests to be seen, and to our eyes, we were welcomed in 3 languages by this arch across the road that leads to Varpa. Walking around, it was noticeable that there had once been a place with lots of Latvians. There were buildings with Latvian names and sayings written on them, as well as Latvian street names, and the local cemetery had hundreds of graves with Latvian names. We also found a museum named after its founder, who also collected most of the objects. His name was Jānis Edbergs. It is managed now by his daughter, who's there with the consul in her spare time, and she also runs one of the local shops. Then, through sugarcane fields, on to Fazenda Palma, which is not very far from Varpa. Palma was a self-sufficient commune established by the founder of Varpa, Enķis, after he became fed up with the lazy, non-productive ways of the Varpa inhabitants. Palma is a very pleasant place and gives the impression of an open-air ethnographic museum. There are buildings from the early years, and much of the equipment is still in situ. Besides being a preacher, the founder, Jānis Enķis, was also a poet and a publisher. At Palma, you can see his old printing press and lead movable type, as well as old lithographs. There are also issues of his magazine, Kristīgais draugs. Back to Novo Odessa now, to have a look at a project that combined the past, the present, and a view to the future. Daina Gutmanis, the honorary consul of Latvia and Brazil, had for some time been determined to bring together a lot of books and other things that had been stored in people's homes in order to build a Latvian cultural center in Novo Odessa. The building project had been favorably received by the mayor of the city, and Daina was waiting for the right time. The main funder of this project was the World Federation of Free Latvians, and 2 librarians from the National Library of Latvia worked together with local people for a month in 2015. And I joined them there for 2 weeks. As you can see, not much space, but everybody managed. At the end of the project, a presentation was given to the city council with local Latvians and their friends also participating. What was interesting was that my librarians had put a small display of the oldest books in Gothic script for people to see. And it was interesting to see how fascinated young people were with these old books, even though they had great difficulties reading them. For Latvian heritage to be maintained abroad, the help of a strong leader is necessary. And without a doubt, Daina Gutmanis has provided this strong leadership. She participates in all Latvian national days, such as Independence, Memorial Days for deportations. And Daina, just a couple of weeks ago, was presented with an award for her services by the State Parliament of São Paulo. You may remember that I said earlier that maintenance of language is one of the cornerstones of ethnic heritage, maintaining intangible cultural heritage. Daina has been instrumental in encouraging setting up Latvian language classes for children and adults. Why do so many middle-aged Latvians in Brazil not know the Latvian language? Daina Gutmanis told me something that amazed me. Apparently in the 1960s and 70s, the government of Brazil was paranoid about conspiracies and the possibility of coups. As a result, they forbade the use of any language other than Portuguese at public meetings. This included church services, ethnic minority schools, etc. Spies even reported it when they had attended such meetings. As a result, a whole generation of Latvians in Brazil were not able to use their language in public in any natural way. It must have taken very determined Latvian parents to keep Latvian as the home language during this period. More intangibles: community participation in Midsummer Solstice Festival, Jāņi, commemorating the Baltic Way together with Lithuanians and Estonians. And in Brazil, Latvians interact with the other two Baltic nations the same as we do everywhere in the world. And most of all, encouraging and supporting Latvian Brazilian young people. Their interest in participating and carrying on Latvian traditions will be paramount in maintaining ethnic identity. I should like to thank several people for help in Brazil and also afterwards. My librarians from the National Library, and also Inte Beyer from the National Library of Latvia. And of course, Daina Gutmanis, who you see on the left there, for being such a locomotive for the Latvian train in Brazil. And also a young man called Lukas Stepanov for being so enthusiastic about being a Latvian. I could devote a whole lecture to this young super patriot. But identity, is he a Latvian Brazilian or a Brazilian Latvian? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Smith. And now we come again to the University of Deusto in Bilbao. Now it's the turn of Mr. Rafael Zafco Garcia, who is if I'm not wrong, a PhD student at the University of Deusto, who's going to give a talk on the historical background of the Basque diaspora in Latin America, integration and tensions.
This presentation is based on, well, it's part of my thesis. The working title is The Basque Digital Diaspora. And basically in researching specific groups of the Basque diaspora in Argentina. My focus is specifically Argentina, and the left-wing nationalist movements in Argentina and how they use the internet to communicate and to maintain their identity ties and political struggle with similar groups in the homeland. And on this presentation, I'll try to explain a bit more of the history of the Basque diaspora in Latin America, not just in Argentina, but Latin America as a whole. Explaining a bit of the tensions, the different waves of Basque migration from the 16th century up to the 70s and 80s, and the tensions between these different groups along the time, along this period. So basically, the focus of the thesis on Argentina, communication mobilization, the role of internet, and I focus on these specific groups, Independentista, Euskal Herriaren Lagunak, which means Friends of the Basque Country, JK Rosario, which is a small group from the city of Rosario in Argentina, and the Askatasunaren Bidea, which means the way towards independence, which is a small group from Buenos Aires. First of all, I have to define I'm not going to bore you with the definition of diaspora, as everybody knows, I believe here, what diaspora means, but specifically the Basque diaspora definition is important to highlight. On the previous session, there was this brief discussion on where the Basque came from. They are divided between Spain and France, and in Spain, within two different political communities. There's a French Basque Country called Iparralde, or Northern Basque Country, which is not a region itself in France, but it's within the department of the Pyrénées-Atlantique, and now I guess it's the macro region of Aquitaine. And in the Basque Country, in Spain, they're divided between the Basque Autonomous Community and the Foro Community of Navarre. And as I mentioned, I'll focus on Latin America, the Basque diaspora towards Latin America, and divided this Basque diaspora in 4 different waves. And I'll briefly comment on each of such waves. So first, we have the so-called original Basque diaspora from the 16th to the 18th century. They were mostly rich Basques, merchants, and members of the Spanish Empire. They were administrative figures, leading traders, merchants, and they also were viceroyals and governors of regions such as Cuba, for instance, or Peru. So they were really, they had this huge connection with the Spanish crown. They were part of the Spanish Empire within the Americas. And like some of you might know, the Royal Company of Guipuzcoan Company of Caracas, the Compañía Real Compañía Guipuzcoana de Caracas, which was one of the greatest companies of merchants within Latin America, founded by those from Guipuzcoa, one of the Basque regions, historical regions. The second wave is a wave from the 19th century. It's a wave, there are two different sets of Basques in this particular wave. One, impoverished Basques. They were seeking jobs, especially in Uruguay and Argentina, but as well in the United States a few years later, in the beginning of the 20th century. As Patrick mentioned on his conference, many Irish fled to the Americas, to United States and Canada and etc. Due to the rules and the laws of inheritance on the country, which the first son receives the land and the others have to seek a way of living. So the same happened to the Basques. The first son would receive the land and the rest had to migrate. You have to remember that the Basque Country is a very small region, and it was really hard for a family of 10, 12 sons to survive in just a very small portion of land. So a lot of them used to migrate to Argentina, to Uruguay, later to the United States and other countries in Latin America in order to get rich, and sometimes come back to the Basque Country, though most of them never came back. And there's a small overlap of this first and the second wave. Also, there was many refugees from the Spanish War of Independence against Napoleon and the Carlist Wars. That was also mentioned before, the first and the third Carlist War, which was a war of succession royal succession in Spain. And the Basques were in the wrong side. Well, they lose, so probably the wrong side. And there's this overlap between the first and the second waves at some point during the 19th century. And at this moment, the so-called Euskal-Etxeak, which is plural for Euskal-Etxea, or Basque houses, Basque house, they were founded all over the Latin America. And I'll come back later to these Basque clubs. The third wave can be described as also of refugees, but this one specifically of refugees from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. And is a very particular wave, as not maybe most, but a lot of members of these a lot of people came from this wave were members of the Basque Nationalist Party, the PNV. That was founded in the end of 19th century and was starting to grow in the Basque Country and to become a real power in the region before the Spanish Civil War. And up to today, they're still the main political party in the Basque Country and also within the diaspora. So it brought a lot of tensions within the diaspora with the former waves. The fourth and final wave is also a wave of refugees, but mostly left-wing ones. Members of ETA, the guerrilla group in the Basque Country, especially active on the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Also family members, sympathizer, or general left-wing individuals that had to flee from the Basque Country to seek refuge, especially in Argentina at this point, also Uruguay. So as I've mentioned, the Euskal-Etxeak, they were Basque places, Basque houses founded during mostly for those of the second wave in order to help the newcomers. Most of them were sheep herders, cattle herders. They helped building the Uruguay and Argentinian nations, as they were always going to inside the country and expelling the indigenous population and, well, helping the new European population to settle on the interior of such countries. So these clubs were firstly founded as a way to support those in need. If they were sick, they would help them. If one of them died, were murdered by someone, or died, or had some problem, they would help them dispatching the body back, and etc. So pay for medical bills and etc. So it was basically first a place to help those in need, but also a place to experience home, a simulation of the environment of the homeland, with all the tensions, with the politics and etc. So to some extent, they also tend to emulate the homeland politics and even political disputes among the different political parties. And those disputes you can see even nowadays, especially in Argentina. So the main goal of this presentation is actually to present these three major moments of tensions within these different political waves. So the first one, the first big tension is the tension between the old Basques, meaning those Basques from the Spanish enterprise, from the Spanish imperial enterprise that were in America since the 16th century, or I've put it 15th century because a few scholars, but a lot of enthusiasts would say that the Basques reached the coast of Canada even before Christopher Columbus, as well as Christopher Columbus' ship was a Basque ship, and most of his crew as well were Basques. And the tension between these old Basques and the so-called fueristas, which mean those who lost the Carlist War while defending the fueros, which is basically the ancient law that ruled the region, and they had virtual internal independence from Spain. They were not obliged to serve in the army. They didn't have to pay taxes to Spain. They just were part of Spain, but with almost complete internal independence. Well, there's of course, some debates over this because, of course, some of them would pay taxes and say, no, this is just like something that I'm giving to the crown. But, so there's some debates over which kind of independence we're talking about within the fueros. It's important to note that during this process of building the Spanish identity, there wasn't really an identity issue within these old Basques and the fueristas. They all had this idea of Basque ethnic identity with the Spanish civic identity. The dispute was more about a sense of Basqueness from those who were arriving, and a different idea of politics, of the defense of these fueros, which were not that important for those who were already in Spain for a long time, and they were considered too much Latinized. They were not really Basque. They tend not to speak Basque anymore. Most of them only spoke Spanish and etc. So at to some extent, the foundation of the Euskal Herriak were also a way to protest against the abolition of the fueros as a symbol. We are here, we are defending the fueros, we are here in the diaspora, and this is how we do politics. The second moment of tension will be in the beginning of the 20th century, of the fueristas against the newcomers of the Basque Nationalist Party, the PNUistas. Now you have a dispute that is very centered on identity, as those from the PNV, they would say, I'm Basque, I'm not Spanish at all. Civic and ethnic identity are pretty much the same. And up to the beginning of 1920, 1930, you would see, for instance, a Basque flag side by side with the Spanish flag on the Basque clubs. When those members of the PNV start taking the control of these clubs, you will never see again a Spanish flag in these institutions. So there was a huge identity issue. Also, the idea of the Basque Nationalist Party was to defend the fueros. They would defend these ancient laws, but they would demand independence. And for the fueristas, the idea was not independence, was more a virtual internal one, but within Spain. During the 20th century, especially after the Spanish Civil War, the PNV would take full control of most of the Basque clubs, the Euskal Herriak. Also, specifically in Argentina, you have Spanish clubs, you have the French club, you have the Navarre Basque club. So there's also this ethnic tension within Basques from different parts, not just the political one, not just this specific identity tension that the PNV brought to the diaspora. The third and the last main focus of tension would be from the 70s up to today, which are supporters of the Basque Abertzale, which means nationalist left, and the previous group, the PNUistas, the supporters of the Basque Nationalist Party. In the 70s, you have a radical opposition against Franco. A lot of left-wing sympathizers would say that the PNV was not strong enough against Franco, and many of them had to flee to the diaspora, especially to Argentina and Uruguay, but also the United States in less extent. And it's a wave that is not exactly, there's not exactly a huge number of people escaping from Spain to Latin America, but it's very politically charged. So it's a group that is very, very politically radical. And despite they don't have exactly the numbers to take the control of the Euskal Herriak, but they would try to take control of the Basque clubs during the 70s, the 80s, and up to the 90s when the Euskal Herriak, for instance, in Argentina would split with the ancient Spanish Lauracbat, which is the name of the Basque house in Buenos Aires. They would split, and there's a small house now specifically connected with the left-wing nationalist groups. So you'll have lots of conflicts, other ideological groups during this period. There's a specific moment in Uruguay, for instance, that is called the Filtro Hospital Massacre, which mobilized thousands of people in Uruguay because there was a group of Basque left nationalists that were going to be deported to the Basque Country, Spain, to face trial because they were accused of being ETA members. And there was a huge mobilization that the Euskal Herriak were not taking part of the mobilizations due to this political dispute of those who are from the Basque Nationalist group, the Basque Nationalist Party, and those who are from the left-wing nationalist groups. So the left-wing started joining with the different grassroots groups from Uruguay to protest, to protest the extradition of these Basque militants. And it ended up with thousands of people demonstrating on the streets. One person was killed by the police, and over 100 were wounded with gunshots during these demonstrations. And it's very interesting because the president of the Basque house, the Basque club in Montevideo, at the end of all this violence, gave his support to those who were demonstrating against the deportation. And the president of the Basque Country at the time said that, no, you shouldn't meddle into the Uruguayan politics, you shouldn't help this left-wing nationalists and etc. So you see even nowadays this tension. So, well, as a conclusion, I would say that I've at least tried to demonstrate that these tensions were all around the Basque clubs, and they reflected to some degree the homeland politics, this dispute between the Basque Nationalist Party and the left-wing nationalists. I would say Basque nationalists, left-wing nationalists, as there are many different political parties that have been illegalized over the time, so I cannot really say just the name of one group. And they also tend to have tensions around geographical divisions of the Basque country, as you have in Argentina, for instance, a club in Buenos Aires, and in Rosario, for instance, you have a French club, a Spanish club, and a Navarre club. So they're not really together all the time. And these waves of migrants and refugees shape the diaspora itself. And from the basic promotion and maintenance of ethno-national identity to proxies of the Basque government and spaces for the promotion of a diasporic identity and homeland diaspora politics, the Euskal Herriak are the reflex of the homeland, but also very autonomous and in constant move and evolution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eskerrik asko. Now I would propose to stop here for a while and to have a 10-15 minutes discussion of all 5 papers before we jump into the second part of the session, because otherwise we have the discussion at the end of the session. I'm afraid that those who presented first are perhaps, or could perhaps have their papers forgotten. So may I ask you for raising your hand in order to collect questions for the speakers? I think we have time for 2, 3, 4 questions. Professor Moya?
Yeah, a question for I mean, if this exodus from Ukraine, if there is a different origins and and directions. That if Eastern Orthodox, Russian-speaking Ukrainians are moving to Russia, and it is Western, they're non-Orthodox, I don't know if they're Catholic. Ukrainians are moving to the West. That's a question. For Rafael, I mean, the third and the fourth waves are not exactly waves, right? Even the exile during the Spanish Civil War, there was very few who made it to Latin America. Most of them made it to Mexico, but we're talking about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people at all in total. If the proportion of that is Basque, we're talking about, and the fourth wave, we may be talking about hundreds of people at the most. I don't know if you have any specific numbers.
Okay. But propose we collect questions before you answer. Any more questions? Okay, then. You're entitled to answer.
Professor Moya is obviously right. There's a big division between Western Oblast, Western counties, and the Eastern one. The Eastern are more rich, more industrialized, and more Russian dependent. And the Western are the poorer. The one I was mentioning, which are more affected by mobility, forced mobility, exactly in that part of the Ukraine, and especially migrant women which go towards southern countries, southern Europe, or the one which go according circular migration towards Poland or Czech Republic. They come especially from their areas. But I could only add that to divide the national problem, the identity problem in Ukraine in Western against Eastern is not so easy, because there are strong regionalist identities, and if you wanna telling it's not my problem, it's the problem of the other side is exactly a part of the problem. So what I simply meant, I was trying to tell is something like, what about if Ukraine could be another side of Portugal dimension in the way that Maria Beatriz showed us this morning? I think that they should celebrate migration as the basis of economics resistance. If you could get back and take a look at the remittances, it's all there. It's all there. They are completely neglecting the problem. Sort of nationalistic rhetoric tells that those women who goes abroad are traitors, are bitches, as told President Kuchma. And someone replied, so if our women which leaves the country and the families are bitches, you're an international pimp. You understand what pimp means? That's all.
Okay. Of course.
It's very interesting what you said about the remittances, because very recently, because of the very large number of Latvians abroad at the moment, they estimate that, for example, the Latvians remit to the country every year more than 5 million euros. So that's a considerable addition to the local economy that's sent from Latvians abroad back home.
Okay.
Yes, Gloria Totoricagüeña was one of the first to mention the idea of waves of Basque migration, though she divided only in two. The first one up to 1898 and the second one up to today. But Oscar Álvarez Gila from the University of Basque Country and also César Arrondo, Universidad de La Plata, I was with him last year, interviewing him exactly specifically about the waves. They would consider the idea of waves not of a huge population moving from a side and the other, but more of the importance of such migration to the Basques who were at the diaspora. Like, for instance, the number of members of the PNV or sympathizers or those who migrated and then became sympathetic to the nationalistic ideas of the PNV, for instance, they were probably 100,000. There's more or less this number, 100,000 people who migrated during the 20s and the 30s. And considering the number of Basques already there, yes, it's...
So you say 100,000?
Something between 100,000
migrated
during the beginning of the 20th century.
That's not possible.
According to Alsua and some other authors.
I don't really think these figures are realistic, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But anyway,
And
if you consider average, the whole number of Basques who migrated, you say people more or less sympathetic to PNV.
No, during that period, not necessarily sympathetic to PNV.
All right,
I'm saying during that period.
Okay, understood you.
Yes, during that period.
Have understood you
And
correctly.
just, of course, a portion, a fraction of them were sympathizers of the PNV. The idea of wave is not exactly due to the number of 100,000 people who migrated, but basically that just a small number of those ideologically compromised with the political party were able to take control of the scholarship. And during the 70s, there were a lot of political tensions, not only within the Basque clubs, but also politically with other groups within Uruguay, within Argentina, the government, the Spanish embassy, and etc. So it's probably 200 people, even less, that migrated during that 70s, for instance. But they were very important politically to the shift of pattern migration.
Say that they took over these centers. I mean, they took over almost by default. These centers were dying. No one was going there. The previous population was aging, right? So
it depends. It depends of which center. It depends of each center. There were centers that, of course, when they arrived, there was almost no competition, or like the center in Rosario that they have founded, the PNV founded. But for instance, the La Roque Bat in Buenos Aires, there was a struggle. In some other countries, I remember in Chile also there were conflicts. In Cuba especially, there was conflict. So of course, I'm talking generally, but of course, if you want, you have to analyze center by center, which would be at the time 50, 40 centers.
There's another question here, please.
Since we are here from the Basque government, according to the data that our predecessor had, the very first Basque government led by José Antonio Aguirre and Lehendakari Aguirre, at least 150,000 people had to go into exile because of the Spanish Civil War from the Basque Country. Just this number. Yes. Outside of the Basque Country.
Yes.
Yeah.
At least 150,000 people.
But sorry, which period? At what point?
When
37.
When
Between 37 and 39.
the Spanish Civil War started, July 36, up until the war is over in the Basque Country, it will be summer 1937.
Yeah, but you know that as it happens to most Spanish Republican refugees, a number of them came back.
Yeah, we were talking about
where
exact
obviously
figures and
are
data.
disputes.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the
Yes.
it depends on the chronology, on the chronological point.
Some
But-
came back, but
I mean,
but
there were a lot of people.
The vast
anyway.
majority could not, and you know why.
That's not true. No, it's not my personal opinion. I'm a historian. I know what I'm talking about. I mean, not only regarding the Basques, also regarding other communities. There's your question here.
Can I ask a question, or yeah? Not actually. I wanted to address a question on Federica, the first colleague who presented, and Federica would perhaps would like to hear a bit more about the methods again. I mean, sorry to ask again all the time about the methodology, like the ethnographic fieldwork, your fieldwork, some more details, or I don't know, conceptual frameworks of your ethnography. And the second question is that if you take into consideration on your research cases of infrastructural or structural racism that are ongoing in Switzerland, like if we see the there was a referendum, I think last year, the 51% of the population voted about the EU workers or immigrants in Switzerland that they don't want them. I'm like a no to them, if I'm correct about it. And secondly, as a case of infrastructural racism on the policies on confiscating assets on refugees. I mean, what I'm asking is that if this research that you are part of it, if you take into consideration aspects of structural racism by bureaucratic procedures or institutions. So that's why I just gave these two examples. I'm not, yeah, thanks.
So I will start from the last question. Actually, the referendum that you are talking about, yeah, it happened in 2014, and also recently, just 2 days ago, in Ticino, that is a canton. This was a vote in order to reduce the cross-border workers from Italy. So that's something really ongoing. It's a really fervor debate on this issue, because on the one hand, Switzerland, it's we can say an immigration country where the migrants, the people who moved in, are really fundamental for the economic. And on the other, so Switzerland is attracting migrants, but on the other, they don't want them. So that's really controversial also on a political level, because these cross-borders workers are actually called by the, not necessarily by the Swiss industries or the Swiss economic activities, but by the pharmaceutical industry, for example, who is in Switzerland. And this industry has really, they take advantage of these cross-border workers, because the workers wanted to have a less income compared to the Swiss one, because of course they don't live in Switzerland, so they don't need 5,000 euro per month to live, at least. And so they also, they accept 10% or 20% also, on the average on the incomes. And so it's also an advantage for the industries and the companies who are hiring them. But and that's also something that the Confederation is actually allowing. And but on the others, there are these kind of racist tendencies, if we can call like that, that are try to prevent the income of workers. So it's, yeah, it's a complicated matter. Also, for example, this last vote in Ticino is actually now needed to go to the confederational level. So need to go to the confederation to be discussed to see if it's actually possible, if it's constitutional, or if it's not. So if they cannot do that. So did this answer this, or and for the conceptual framework, I actually looked into the migration literature, especially for the part concerning return, of course. So return dreams, return fantasies, or some more recent return imageries. And I found some interesting research who are actually focused on the houses, because that was mainly the point that I wanted to address that I didn't manage. For example, there are researches, not necessarily in the European geographic framework, but also outside Europe, like one really tied to this research that I've been doing in Switzerland is one of Cassiman. She's a researcher, and she did research in Ghana, and she studied the Akasina. This is a group of a population, and the young people are both women and men are moving to the cities, and they are all investing money to build the houses, mainly rooms, in the house of the paternal family and clan. And this shows not necessarily, not only an idea of final return, but also there are other implications, emotional implications, representational implications, and also a matter of power and prestige, because building a room in the house of the family shows that you did it, so you increase your status. And the other research that I found interesting is that of Bolognani. She studied the Pakistani in the UK, and she used this concept of transition. She adopted the concept of transitional objects, and she used a different concept of transitional space to refer to this return, she called the return fantasies of the Pakistani in UK. And she said that this transitional space of return fantasies is fundamental when a person is displaced for its home, because it's allow for continuity and create a comfort zone when one person is outside of the comfort zone. But most importantly is open the possibility, at least discursively, not necessarily for a physical return, but discursively people are able to foresee different paths. So they are not stuck in just one reality that maybe is not the ideal one that they expected before migrating. And so thanks to this these discourses, that they are able to re-engage with the migration experience. So, yeah.
I've just looked for the reference from Tapith Fernandez. Over 200,000 Basques is a conservative estimative migrated from the Basque Country to the Latin America from the 19th century to 1930s. 200,000 is a conservative estimate.
I was not referring to the total figures of Basques who migrated, because I understood. I didn't understand.
Oh, you thought I was saying there was members of the.
Okay. Were people more or less sympathetic?
Oh,
to
no, yes.
So there was the reason why I found your figures. But, I mean, it's okay. Now I would propose we make a very short break, 5 minutes break, and then we go over to the next 4 papers. We have Valasek, Christensen, Ike, and Gosso. Is that correct, or do you want to continue without any break at all? Yes, because it's quite hot. I think we all need a refreshing interlude. Thank you. So we can change the table. Thank you very much to all speakers. Then is Penile. Then is Simona, and Elisa will close the session. So we will try to have at least 5 minutes for the final discussion, if possible.
Oh, it can be less. Do it less.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we continue the session with 4 very interesting papers. First, on my right, geographically speaking, there's Adam Valasek, Professor Adam Valasek from Jagiellonian University in Krakow, who is going to give a paper from the May 3 Constitution Day, celebrating the Biartek, blah, blah, blah. Snow, Polish and Polish diaspora culture in the United States, 1870-1930. Professor Valasek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The blah 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 is the most important actually here.
Sorry.
No, what I'm going briefly to say is to present you my own. Well, it's not only mine, a vision of few colleagues of mine, the Polish American scholars, the vision which I share about how the identity among Polish immigrants in America, in the United States, was changing, and to be more precise, how was it shaped? How was it created? How was it imposed? Because we are here starting from the 0 level, similarly like with the Ukrainians we were hearing about a minute ago, hour ago. They were coming to America. The labor migrants, the labor-seeking migrants were coming with almost zero knowledge about who they were. This was the local identity. This was the identity of what we call the private homeland, which we were bringing themselves. And then there was at the same time the bunch of people who were coming parallelly to or even they started to come before. The déclassé nobles, the intelligentsia people, the political refugees who were fleeing from Poland, and particularly from Prussian Poland, and from Russian Poland after the catastrophe of the January uprising, people who were marked, people who were contaminated by the ideology, by the tragedy of the last Polish uprising, the January uprising of 1869. And these were the people who wanted to create out of the mass labor migration of peasants the group, and to use them for the purpose they had in mind. And there are three, at the time I'm going to talk about, there are three sub-periods, so to speak. The first one takes place before World War I, and it's marked by the formation by the two clearly ideological, political, you may say, but this is ideological camps. The first one, and this is what divides them, is the vision of how to form, into whom to form these labor migrants comings. Hundreds of thousands of them, maximum probably 2.5 million people, many of them returned, okay. The first vision is the vision of shaped by the order of resurrectionists. This is the one formed as early as in 50s in France, but then they started to work and to teach or to spread their message elsewhere, and became very extremely important, strong. In America, they get from the Pope the right to govern the souls of Polish immigrants. And they were extremely, from the very beginning, from 50s and after the 60s particularly, they were extremely anti-Polish independentists, Polish idea of struggle for Polish independence, because this led nowhere, just to catastrophe. The January uprising undoubtedly was a huge catastrophe. So what they proposed, but at the same time, they knew these people coming to America, the labor migrants, must be lost for the Polish nation in which they believed. So their goal was to save these people, but the only way of saving them was not to teach them these stupid nationality slogans, etc., but to teach them and to keep them within the church. To be Paul meant to be the Catholic. Saving the Catholicism among the Polish Americans in the States meant save Polishness in America for the future. It's not the people, lud in Polish, who is going to save Poland. It's cud, the miracle, the God's miracle is going to save Poland. This is what they preached. This is they were taught. But at the same time, of course, the Polishness, the term Poles was there. The second group was formed, and then there is a secular organization following that, formed in 1873, the Polish Roman Catholic Union. The second one is formed, the second camp is formed in 1880s. This is Polish National Alliance, and they are of the belief that this is the people who are going to save Polish independence, who are by fighting for it. They have to be taught to be the Polish secular, their religion and their ideology regardless, Poles, formed as Poles, and to fight, to struggle for Polish independence. It's lud who is going to fight for Poland. And skipping all the activity of theirs, which was extremely many fields, obviously. I will just say a few words about one, which is the propaganda they were using, and that's the propaganda via art, via theater. Theater became extremely important, strong weapon in these teachings. So these people, both these camps were using theater for teaching Poles different versions of Polishness, Poles in America, or immigrants in America. They were celebrating Polish national occasions like the Constitution of the 3rd of May mentioned in the title. For instance, the very extremely important secular Polish celebration, the anniversaries of the uprisings. But what they were doing, this was celebrated in a totally different way, and sometimes it's very funny and entertaining. What the resurrectionists were doing, what the PRCU was doing, yes, they were celebrating the Constitution of the 3rd of May, but putting on stage the piece, the drama written by the local Polish author, about the defense of Polish monastery of Częstochowa with the Black Madonna against the Swedish invasion in 1655. It's not that much Poland, Polish independence, it's Madonna, it's religion against versus these barbaric Protestants, right? Whereas what the Polish National Alliance was doing and the other similar group, they were putting on stage secular, usually brought from Poland, pieces and talking exactly about the historical fact. There were such dramas about the Constitution of the 3rd of May, etc., etc. These are not Polish saints or Polish Christian queens, which were on the stage of the theater of PRCU of resurrectionists, but these were the secular nationalistic, you may say. But the message was totally different, and going somewhere. All right, the second chapter of this story is World War I, because all of that, the very deep conflict, definitely ideological struggle, they were very nasty against each other. There is no doubt about it. This is over before World War I for the reasons, because the war is really coming. The atmosphere in America is changing, and the new generation of leaders, intellectuals, new generation of intellectuals is coming, and the old conflict, and that's on both sides, the old conflict sometimes, well, simply dies out. There is a danger of radicalism, the new enemy appears. So during World War I, both camps, the resurrectionists, the PRCU and the PNA, start together the actions supporting the idea of Polish independence, collecting money, knocking at the American politicians' doors, organizing the meetings, etc. But of course, making all sorts of propaganda issues, publishing pamphlets, brochures, what have you. And they are basically successful. This is not to say that American Polonia, Polish Poles in America resurrected Poland. That's not their really. This did not happen because they're very clear and very strong activity. It happened. It would happen anyhow, but they were very supportive for these actions during the war and right after, particularly when Poles were fighting for the shape of the borders. And so Polish Americans have a good reason to be very much proud of their activity during World War I, which was purely political activity directed towards the independent Poland period. And of course, this it's a very difficult thing to measure, but judging by the fruits, by the effects of these efforts, they reached the souls of the Polish American workers in all these industrial towns. They interiorized the message, this very message. We are Poles, right? The second and the third chapter comes after World War I, and it has to do primarily with what was happening in America. The quota system is established finally. Well, it starts to be in 21, and then finally it's in 1924. Nobody is coming anymore. Virtually nobody is coming to America, and those who are not naturalized in America do not want to go back to Poland. And those who went back to Poland were bankrupted, so nobody. The idea of return is over. The American Polonia, political circles in America, Polonia, and in deep conflict with the Polish, simply Polish authorities, Polish government. Different political factions won the souls in America, and very different while Piłsudski was really a socialist, right, something like that, was ruling in Poland. So American Polonia started too. The first signs is the year 1921, 22, 23 is very clear, 25 is definitely final and decisive. There were gatherings of Polish organizations in America each year, the conventions, the Polish National Diets, they called it the Polish conventions. All of representatives and politicians from all political organizations participated. And during the ones in 23, 24, they said, this is America. This is not Poland. We've done as much as we could for Poland. Now let's take care of our own businesses here. This is the time of nativism, of course. The atmosphere is still, or the first years after World War I, the atmosphere was very dense. So ideologically, there is a very big switch towards the, among the Polish American politicians, among the Polish American ideologues, leaders, simply towards doing the business not to prevent Americanization, but to become American. And there is no contradiction in it. To become Polish Americans at the same time. And plus to support, to present the group as equally important and equally valuable to members of the American society, to the WASPs, etc. In a similar way, Swedes very successfully did at the end of 19th century, and later on they continued. In the similar way, the Italians were trying to do it, and also they turned out to be very successful, to show the greatness of Polish nation in the world history. But this is not to show the heroic Polish kings winning in the battles. This is not to show the Polish hero dying in the uprisings. This was to show the Polish world-known authors like John Konrad Korzeniewski, scientists like Maria Skłodowska-Curie, Frederick Chopin, etc. To reach this message to American society, these are the sons of our lands, of our homeland. And they are the heroes of both sides. You play Chopin and you admire Chopin. You profit from what Skłodowska-Curie did, etc., etc. The new clubs are formed. The new cultural clubs are formed, propagating this message. Polish American clubs, cultural clubs. This is the message at the same time directed towards Poles in America, or Polish Americans, but predominantly to Americans, to English-speaking population. And that's one kind of stream. And the last one is, yes, I know, is this which mysteriously you omitted. The second current, which appeared as very new and very fresh, this is the folk tradition and folk culture. The Polish American, working class Polish America in 20s and in 30s, this has to do with technical developments, with records, which appear to be very radio in particular. And these are two activities which are extremely important. The first one, that's music, to play, propagate, and to cultivate, to change it. But the music, the roots of that music is that's the folk music from Polish villages. That's the polka music, that's the Krakowiak music. This is what their parents and themselves knew and brought with them to America. But it's transformed in America. It became a little bit jazzy. The lyrics had to do something not only with Poland, but also with America. They were selling hundreds of thousands of these. This is a big, huge business. That's one thing. And finally, it also has to do with the technology, is the radio. The radio, in roaring 20s, the people had money and they could afford, each Polish American family had a radio. And there were, I had some numbers here, but I have no time to find them. In Chicago itself, there was something like 10 Polish language programs. And within this program, not only the polka music was sung, but also the big success appeared in late 20s and in 30s. The show, the comedies, radio comedies. They were written in America by Polish American authors using the Polish American jargon, talking, and they were taking place in Polish American communities. The Bartek Bieda show was the most famous one. Tadeusz Kantor was the author of it, extremely important. It did run until 40s, really. This was serialized, and there was no new episode each year. This was the family, the Bartek Bieda family, and they were commenting in the radio whatever is happening for this working class family in Chicago. In their family, in Chicago, corruption, what have you, all of that was there. America generally, Polonia politics generally, but American issues and American things done in their language, which was the Polish American jargon. It was neither Polish, Gwara, or the dialect, nor, of course, it's mixed. It was loved. It was enormous success, and he also made it to the theater because he was also writing the pieces for the stage, which were performed, which were had a big success. And that's the very new type of identity. It's clearly Polish American working class identity, which now, and they were not ashamed of, and which now they were presented totally and fully accepted. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Dziękuję. So, next paper is going to be presented by Ms. Pernille Christensen, who belongs to the Danish Immigration Archives. So she's linked to the Danish Immigration Archives in Aalborg, Denmark, and the title of her paper is Impacts of the Charge, Processes of Ethnic Safeguarding in Midwestern Danish Immigrant Communities. Please.
Okay, this is on. You can hear me, all of you? Okay, that's good. I'm gonna prefer to stand up because it's very late in the afternoon, and if anybody else prefers to stand up a little, that would be perfectly fine with me, so feel free to do that. Okay, so my name is Pernille, and as was said, I'm a PhD student at Aalborg University in Denmark, and also at the Danish Immigration Archives in Aalborg, Denmark. And I've called today's presentation Impacts of the Church, Processes of Ethnic Safeguarding in Midwestern Danish Immigrant Communities. And this is based on a paper that I did a while ago. But just to say a bit more overall about the project that I'm in the MyClue project, which you were introduced to earlier on when Sarah did a presentation this morning. So the MyClue project is called Migration in a Contemporary and Historical Perspective. And we're sort of trying to compare historical and contemporary cases of migration to and from Denmark in different time periods. So whereas Sarah looked at migration to Denmark from Romania and Turkey, I look at immigration from Denmark to the US and to Australia as well. So in order also to create a different angle to migrant discussions in Denmark, I'm investigating sort of, you could say the Dane as a migrant abroad. In more detail, I'm looking into how being Danish is being practiced and preserved and passed on through generations in these countries. So in the US, it's from 1850 till 1920. And in Australia, it's a bit further on in history. It's from the 1960s until the 1980s. So, but what I'm going to concentrate on today is the research that I've been doing in the US. I went to the US in the summer of 2014 and did a number of biographical narrative interviews with people of Danish descent. So I'm sort of examining a legacy of that case of Danish migration. Okay, so at this point in time, just to say a bit about the background of this migration case. So from 1850 until 1920, about 300,000 Danes went across the Atlantic with that wave of millions of other Europeans. And I guess that Danish migration case somewhat resembles what we've heard earlier on and in other examples, for example, from Dietmar about German migration to the US. But from Denmark, it was about 300,000 people, which was about 10% of the population at this point in time. It was typically servants, craftsmen, and farm workers, particularly the ones who didn't own any land, because even though Denmark at that point in time had got a democratic constitution, those rights did not come out to everybody in society. Particularly not the ones who did not own any land of their own. So they found it very appealing to go to the United States to get a very cheap or a free piece of land and to sort of work their way up and create better futures for themselves and their kids. Yes. So just very briefly about where they settled in the US. Many Danes did not settle amongst themselves, but others did indeed do so. And you know, the Danish-sounding place names on this map very much reveals that. So the Danes primarily settled in the Midwestern states of Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Minnesota. And when I went over there in the summer of 2014, I went to some of these places to talk to the descendants of the people who had migrated there generations before. So I went to Chicago, which is here. I went to Tyler in Minnesota, and I went to Blair in Nebraska, which is here. And those particular places were chosen because they represent different types of settlements. So even though you probably cannot call Chicago Danish settlement, but a multicultural city, a definite Danish community arose in that city too. So it represented different kinds of places due to the urban versus the rural, and also due to the intermission settlement, which was Blair, Nebraska, and the Grundtvigian Tyler in Minnesota, and sort of therefore allowed for the measurement and comparison between these categories. Yes, I'm going to return to that Grundtvigian intermission thing a bit later on. Am I talking too fast, or is it okay? Good. Okay, good. Okay, so what I did with the descendants of these people were, I did a number of biographical narrative interviews. And that is a method where you sort of ask people to tell their life stories on relatively free terms. And when you, as a researcher, you sort of pay attention to how the story is told, what is weighed, what is left out, how is the life story structured, in order to perceive or get a knowledge into how people perceive of themselves. So it's a method that is very good for understanding the self-perception of people. I also applied to the method an intergenerational perspective, meaning that I, when possible, attempted to talk to people of different generations within the same family in order to sort of detect patterns of transmission of different kinds of resources and capital. So even though some say that today families play a minor role as regarding transmission, others say that they still, well, that is due to, you know, globalization, modernity. Others really stress that they still have significant roles to play as regards the transmission of religious views, cultural identity, and so forth, and many other things as well. Okay, so I conducted 31 life story interviews with people of Danish descent, primarily within the 3rd, 4th, 5th generation of Danes. So it might be important to say here that since I specifically asked to talk to people of Danish descent, I would get in touch with people who, at least to some extent, knew about and identified with their Danish ancestry. So the ones that I typically got in contact with were what I've called the family archivists of the archivists of the family, meaning those who collected letters, diaries, photos from the family history to preserve them for future generations. And due to such a sample limitations, I've been merely engaged with exploring how and the extent to which this Danish identity or self-perception as being Danish has survived throughout the generations. Okay. A bit about the intermission and the Grundtvigian Church. So as I mentioned, I was in these two different settlements, the one being an intermission settlement initially, and the other one a Grundtvigian one. So in 1884, there was a split in the Danish church in America between the intermission Danes and the Grundtvigian Danes. And the split concerned the role of cultural heritage in connection to religion. So whereas the conservative pietists, or what have been termed the holy Danes, they sort of stressed a personal relation to faith and repentance, and weighed the community with other Christian and brothers and sisters. The Grundtvigian Danes very much encouraged the maintenance of Danish cultural identity and Danish practices. So the Grundtvigian Danes were inspired by the life view and writings of a Danish poet and priest and teacher called Grundtvig. And they actually saw cultural practice and belonging as a precondition for religious acquisition. So that was sort of the difference between the two. Yeah. Okay. So what I did in this paper was that I tried to see whether, or the extent to which Danishness had been safeguarded in these 3 settlements in the US throughout history. And to look at how ethnic identity has been safeguarded is also to highlight the acculturation process, because acculturation depends on the extent to which you want to maintain a relation to your culture and your traditions, and also if you want to sort of have a relation to the broader society, including other ethnic groups. So when you measure safeguarding, you sort of look into how that ethnic identity is being strengthened from the inside, but also how you sort of want to create the boundaries to other ethnic groups. Yeah. Okay, so what I did was that in these interviews, I had identified 3 ways that Danish ethnic identity had been safeguarded throughout these generations. And the one was safeguarding Danishness through continuous practice. By that I mean the naming, display, and performance of Danishness. How much people talked about what Danishness is, if they were Danish or not. How much things which signaled Danishness was displayed, for example, on signs or other places. Could be, for example, Danish flag or other symbols. And the extent to which Danishness had been performed. Singing Danish hymns, folk dancing, speaking the language, remembering the language, and so forth and so on. And then the second way of safeguarding Danishness that I identified was through rejecting intermarriage, meaning that in the interviews that I collected, there were stories about how families had rejected their children, for example, and rejected them from the Danish community if they had decided to marry out of the Danish group. So such stories were present as well. Third one, parameter of safeguarding Danishness was through preference of a Danish identity. So, for example, in families who had a background of mixed marriages, in some instances, people would hide or wait to tell me that their background was in fact mixed, and so claim their Danish identity more so than other ethnic options that they would have. So that could also be a way of safeguarding it, of continuing to perceive yourselves as Danish more so than other ethnicities or ethnic options. Yeah. So how much time?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. I'm gonna jump to the final slide. Just saying that the findings of this paper was that, particularly between Blair and Tyler, the Grundtvigian and the Inner Mission settlement, there was a diversion in the extent when measuring on these parameters to which Danishness had been safeguarded. So in Tyler, there would be much more stories about, or people structuring their life stories according to the Danish practices and then perceiving themselves to be Danish. There would be much more practice of Danishness. There would also be stories of how families had rejected their kids, or discouraged them to marry outside of the Danish group and encouraging them to marry inside of it, for example, by sending them to Danish schools, having them join Danish youth clubs, and so forth. And with regard to the final one as well, claiming a Danish identity that would also be more present in Tyler than in Blair. So there are some indications that even within the same Lutheran church, different synods within that church can have different impacts on the acculturation process, which was the main findings of this paper. Worth mentioning, though, is that in all three spaces or Danish places here, youth today seem to be letting go of that Danish part of their identities. So even in Tyler, young people were to higher extent moving to the bigger cities, and they would not have their life stories revolve so much about being Danish and maintaining the Danish and doing or practicing Danishness and so forth. So that may lead to speculations if ethnic safeguarding and ethnic identity is coming to an end. And that is a question that I don't know how to answer. But yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now I turn to the left, geographically speaking. The speaker is now moving to the right. This is have the pleasure of introducing you Mrs. Simone Eick from Deutsches Auswanderermuseum, the German Immigration Center in Bremerhaven, who is going to present the paper Becoming a Palatine, the Poor Protestant Refugees from Germany and Their Different Identities in London and New York City, 1760. Bitte schön.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come here to Santiago de Compostela and to meet you all again here in this wonderful city. The story of the 13,000 Germans who were called Palatines is in many ways timelessness. In December 2015, we opened a special exhibit at the German Immigration Center in Bremerhaven about the Palatines, but we did not only tell their story, but also tell the stories of the current refugee situation and the situation of the Turkish-German minority in Germany. So we did 3 comparisons. As we did open the special exhibit on December 4th in 2015, we did get a lot of attention from the media and from the politics because it was just 3 months after September 4th when Germany opened its borders for over 1 million refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and many other countries. The Palatines in 1709 changed and used their identity. Some of this behavior was forced on them by others, but sometimes they instrumentalized their identities by themselves, just to get what they most wanted, free land in North America. In the spring 1709, thousands of people from 40 countries of Germany, this was a time when Germany was not united, but many German countries, from 40 countries of Southwest Germany left their farms and homes within 3 months and moved to London via Rotterdam. It was the first mass migration of Germany. In 1709, agriculture is predominant in southwest Germany. The extreme weather conditions in the winter 1709 have catastrophic consequences. Minus 30 degrees Celsius, people freeze to death, parts of the wine and fruit cultivation are destroyed. In the spring, an increase in food prices is the result. The population is sent into a swift spiral of poverty and hunger. Despite the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, large parts of southwest Germany are not at rest. During the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, The inhabitants are rapidly affected by the marches and looting of French troops. Special taxes for war purposes were imposed, from their own side as well as from the enemy. The financial burden becomes increasingly unbearable. This all went on for years, but suddenly the mass migration started in 1709. Why? In 1706, a description of Carolina, the colony Carolina, is published in Frankfurt by Joshua Kochertal. 3 years later, everyone in southwest Germany is speaking of this book. It's called The Golden Book. The Golden Book has a picture of Queen Anne, and the book says Queen Anne invites all immigrants from Germany to settle in her colonies. Meaningless to say that this is all a huge lie. But 13,000 Germans believed the lie and followed the false invitation. There is evidence that the Palatines, when they arrived in London, hold up this picture from Queen Anne. And you may remember the situation last year when a lot of Syrian refugees hold up the picture of Chancellor Angela Merkel. The first group from southwest Germany arrived in Rotterdam in mid-March 1709. The number increased daily. While the German princes tried to stop the immigration with prohibitive rules, the British ambassador Dayrell welcomes the arrivals in Rotterdam. He believes that the German loss of population is of benefit to Great Britain. On his initiative, at the end of April, Queen Anne authorizes British troop transport vessels to carry migrants to London. In mid-May, the first German arrives in London. In June 1709, the Palatines wrote a petition to Queen Anne. It was probably written with the help from people who were aware of both the British sensitives and those of the Germans from the southwest regions. The petition focuses on generating sympathy based on similarities. British hostilities with France are effectively utilized. The petitioners call themselves poor, distressed Palatines, whose ruin has been caused by the merciless cruelty of a bloody enemy, the French. The British ambassador Dayrell contacts his government again in mid-June to reassure himself about his further course of action. Because, quote, he wrote to his queen, "You may have half of Germany, if you please, for they are all flying away." The British government soon decided that they not want to have half of Germany and stopped funding the convoys. However, 13,000 Germans were now in London. Finally, the introduction of British and Dutch defensive measures and the immigration to Rotterdam. In London, meanwhile, there has happened a lot since the arrival of the first Germans. First, the Germans now call themselves Palatines, even though they were inhabitants from the Palatinate, Württemberg, Hesse, Nassau, and other states. Second, the British fear that the cramped living conditions among the Palatines will lead to epidemics. In addition, the charity organizations who help the Palatines anticipate xenophobic unrests due to the concentration of the needy in the certain districts of London and therefore attempts to provide additional accommodations. Queen Anne hands over 1,600 army tents from the Tower of London. Large tent camps are set up in Greenwich, Blackheath, and Camberwell. This is the one in Blackheath, and the charity organizations were right. Groups of young men from London came to the camps and beat up the Palatines. So members of the government reflect on whether settling them in smaller groups in all parts of England could solve the problem. Approximately 3,000 Palatines are settled all over England. And in the villages and in the cities, there were people also fighting against this settlement of the Palatines. Over 3,000 Palatines are sent to Ireland. 2,200 Catholics are sent back to Rotterdam and then to Germany in September 1709, just because they were Catholics. The British only want Protestants. In October 1709, the Board of Trade ultimately agrees to send a larger group of Palatines to New York. Since the majority are farmers and rural workers, they will be employed to make British lands holding profitable. They're also supposed to produce tar for the British Navy. It's called Naval Store for the British Navy. In June 1710, 7 ships reached New York. 2 others arrived in July and August. 470 people died during the crossing. So 2,600 started their new life in the colony of New York. By the beginning of 1711, the money from the British government for the naval stores is spent. Convinced of the future profitability of the project, Governor Hunter from New York pays the expenses for the Germans out of his own pocket. That was a mistake, because a political change of power occurs in London in October 1711. The Tories, always against active British immigration policy, takes over government. And so there was no further money from the government. By July 1711, Hunter's private funds are also exhausted. In New York City, the British owner, Robert Livingston, who owns the land on which the Palatines are settled, immediately writes to his wife, Alida, to stop supporting the Palatines with bread. Alida, forced to deal with the protest from the German, answers, "I wish the Palatines had never come here." The Palatines turn now for help to the Native Americans. Approximately 150 Iroquois Mohawks live at the Schoharie River, that's near Albany. In October 1712, the Palatines sent a delegation to the Mohawks. The Mohawks have no objections to the settlement's wishes expressed by the Germans. So, by spring 1713, at least 450 Germans settled near Schoharie River and lived side by side with the Native Americans. Of course, this was highly illegal from a British point of view. So the Palatines sent a delegation to London in 1718 to make a personal appeal for the German interests to the British government and to make their settlements legal. But the Palatines' appeal is ultimately refused in 1723. They are not offered any title to land in Schoharie, no free land in America after all these years. They started then to buy land from the British. These are their settlements in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. The patterns of belonging of the Palatines changed from the moment they decided to leave their home to travel to Rotterdam. First, they officially lost their citizenship because of the immigration. Second, most of them lost their regional identity as Württemberger, Nassauer, Hessen, and so on, and they all became Palatines. They did that to make themselves stronger, because now they were one group of 13,000, not only 500 Hessen or 1,000 Palatines. Smaller groups are always weaker than bigger. They all agreed they have one common goal: to get free land in America. That was their goal as Palatines. All individual goals were submitted under this group goal. In the end, only 3,000 reached this goal. The others had to live in places they didn't choose. Third, they agreed all to be Protestants when they arrived in England. The British soon realized that there were at least 2,000 Catholics among them, and sent the Catholics back home. The other Palatines didn't protest. And all Palatines agreed to be refugees, even though they weren't. There was no actual threat in southwest Germany in 1709. Being a Protestant refugee from the Palatine gave almost most of them a chance to go to America. The pro-Palatines among the British, on the other side, used the word refugee to support the Palatines. It is much easier to get help and raise money for refugees than for migrants. So the Palatines choose a kind of artificial identity, I would call it Palatine German, to get their wills. And the ones who came to America kept this new identity, and it became the heritage of their children and grandchildren. As you might have seen, there are a lot of issues concerning the Palatines that Europe shares today regarding the immigration in 2015. Some of the people who came are, like the Palatines, classical labor migrants. How will their immigration strategy change Europe's migration and asylum laws and the work of the NGOs today? Some of the people from Afghanistan who came to Germany told the NGOs that they were told in Afghanistan that they would get free land and houses in Germany today. So this is a false information, and it worked. Some of the immigrants of 2015 throw away their passports and claim to be Syrian because as Syrians they had free access to Germany. If some succeed with this strategy, what does that mean for their children? What identity will they choose? A lot of questions that obviously are not new, as the example of the Palatines shows. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ike. Last presentation, but not least, of this afternoon will be that of Elisa Gosso, University of Turin. She's going to give a paper with the title Iglesias de Trasplante, Protestant Migration to South America Between Autonomy and Attachment to the Mother Church, the case of Waldensians. Waldensian. Yes, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, in this paper, I want to raise this concept of the transplanted churches by focusing on one case that was part of my PhD research in social anthropology. That is the migration of the Waldensians, or maybe better, Waldenses, from the so-called Waldensian valleys of Piedmont in Italy to South America, especially to Uruguay and Argentina. In 1970, Valdo Villalpando, Christian Lalive d'Epinay, and Duane Epps edited and published Transplanted Churches, Immigration Protestantism in Argentina, in which they analyzed some cases of European Protestant churches whose members migrated to Argentina and established ethnic units based on their religious belonging. My PhD research focused on Waldensian transnationalism, and so I was very interested in this concept of transplanted churches that sometimes the authors call immigration or ethnic churches. Christian Lalive d'Epinay in particular describes the process of the so-called naturalization of the immigration churches that in this perspective gradually passed from a status of closed and self-referred communities to a status of openness toward the host society. Lalive d'Epinay situates the Waldensian church on the top of his naturalization index. That means that Waldenses adapted faster than other immigration churches to the host society. This categorization offers an efficient analytic framework, although it is somewhat rigid. And Lalive d'Epinay himself admits the limits of his argument when he distinguishes between the concept of naturalization and the stricter concept of assimilation, and writes that in the time of his research, that is in the 70s,
Waldenses kept some characteristics, such as the inclination to live in colonies or to marry with co-religionists. At the same time, the author did a more specific sociological research on the rural community of Colonia Iris, situated in the south of Buenos Aires province, where Waldenses began to settle at the beginning of the 20th century. And the results of this work were published in a book titled Tradition and Change, in which the author presented the sociocultural background of this community. And without going deep into this research, which is very specific, I want to point out one characteristic of this investigation, that is the concept of heritage. In this perspective, the focus of the Waldensian group comes out from the religious environment to extend to a larger sociocultural field that La Live d'Épinay's informants used to call tradition. And following these suggestions, I pass now into the contents of my research that was based on historic investigations and on an ethnographic fieldwork spent between Buenos Aires in Argentina, Colonia Valdense in Uruguay, and the Waldensian valleys of Piedmont. As you maybe know, the Waldensian Church arose in the early Middle Ages as an heretical movement. In 1532, its members decided to adhere to the Protestant Reformation, organizing themselves as a stable church. And Waldenses are scattered in the whole Italian peninsula, but the place in which they are in the majority and where they lived practically from the origin until today is a mountain area of the Cauchan Alps in western Piedmont, informally called the Waldensian Valleys. The beginning of the transoceanic Waldensian migration to South America was part of the great stream of European and Italian migration from the second half of the 19th century to the early 20th century. The prospect of migration reached the Waldensian community in the middle of the 19th century, when an Argentinian politician founded Colonia Esperanza in Santa Fe province and promoted it in the Waldensian valleys. Toward the migration, the Waldensian Church assumed two opposite positions because one group of the pastoral corps was favorable while another group was adverse. And after many discussions, the community abandoned the project of the Argentinian migration. Indeed, an organized collective migration began after a few years as a result of a first spontaneous migration, which gave rise to a substantial migration chain. From 1852 to 1856, some Waldenses of the valleys migrated to Uruguay and settled in the department of Florida to deal with agriculture and animal breeding. And the optimistic news coming from this small immigrant group persuaded many other Waldenses to leave the valleys and migrate to Uruguay. The whole church corps had therefore to accept this situation and mobilize to organize and hold the reins of the phenomenon. In 1857 and 1858, two expeditions led to the migration of more than 200 Waldenses coming from different villages of the valleys. All these people settled together in the department of Florida. The first point I want to highlight concerns the relationship with the other religious groups. The Waldenses were initially supported by the British Embassy in Montevideo through its spokesman, Reverend Pendleton, who was in touch with the Waldensian Church in Italy. In the years that followed, the Waldenses in Uruguay increased their relationship with other Protestant denominations of the country. And historical sources tell that in Florida, there was a Jesuit mission that acted against the Waldensian colony, and Reverend Pendleton searched therefore another place for the Waldensian settlement. He got in touch with the Agricultural Society of the Rosario Oriental that had a plot of land for sale in the department of Colonia on the left side of the Rosario River. Waldenses acquired this land that was called Colonia Valdense and founded a capital village called La Paz. In the following years, the colony expanded until covering an area 6 times bigger than the original. The political class of Uruguay was always interested in the Waldensian settlement. The press at that time often described the Waldensian colonization as a model for the transformation of the Uruguayan rural structures. One of the first problems of the colony was the lack of a Waldensian minister. In 1877, the Waldensian Church sent to Colonia Valdense Daniel Armand Dugon, a minister that succeeded in reinforcing the social and cultural condition of the colony. At the beginning of his assignment, he carried on the already existing project of the building of 2 churches, one in La Paz and the other in a more central area of the colony. He always maintained contacts with the Waldensian church institutions in Italy. At that time, the decision-making body that dealt with the Waldenses abroad was the Waldensian Evangelization Committee that was founded in 1860. And during my researches, I read and analyzed an archival fund that contains a large number of letters that Armand Dugon sent to the committee and to other members of the church from 1877 to 1928. These materials proved to be very interesting to understand the issue of maintaining relations with the Waldensian Church in Italy and revealed the 2 attitudes of the migrated communities. On one hand, it always counted on the mother church as a mediator in order to face the process of adaptation to the new society, but on the other hand, its aspiration to self-determination led to a long process of separation. I would like to emphasize 2 issues that I consider the most significant in this perspective. One is the issue of the internal diaspora and the creation of new colonies. The demographic increase of the primitive colony pushed many families to emigrate not only to other Uruguayan departments, but also to the nearer regions of Argentina. Waldensian institutions looked at this new diaspora with concern because they were worried about the loss of the Waldensian identity. The lack of Waldensian ministers is another issue directly connected with the diaspora. Armand Dugon, in one of his letters, defines this problem as the sheep without a shepherd. In 1882, the Waldensian Church sent another pastor to help Armand Dugon, but sending new ministers was not easy for the church because it had not enough resources, especially financial ones, to maintain the ministers abroad. And this situation led to a reorganization of the congregation. In 1878, the Uruguayan Church asked for autonomy and partially obtained it, thus becoming an autonomous parish. In 1896, it became one of the districts that composed the Waldensian Church at that time. And finally, in 1962, the South American community obtained full autonomy with its own ecclesiastical institutions. The church adopted the name of Iglesia Evangelica Valdense de Rio de la Plata from the name of the river plate that divides Uruguay from Argentina. The first signs of change were evident since the first half of the 19th century. I can say this because of a particular reason. In 1926, South American Waldenses founded the Historical Waldensian Society of South America, and I interpreted this as a sign of the willingness of the South American Waldensian institutions to begin to capitalize its legacy. What I could observe today from my fieldwork and interviews concerns what Christian Lalivie d'Epinay called heritage. But this kind of heritage is not a simple reenactment of the past, but rather a revision and adaptation of the memory to the present life of the congregation. My witnesses pointed out some specific traits that should identify and distinguish the Waldensian people from the rest of the population. In the narratives, ample space has been given to the Waldensian tradition of diaconia, that is social and humanitarian work. South American Waldenses founded indeed the first primary and high schools of the country and have set up several centers for dependent or disadvantaged people, such as retirement homes, facilities for special needs persons, single mothers, and homeless people. They also founded many projects for a sustainable economy and for the promotion of organic agriculture. In the field of cultural life, in 1926, they have founded historical and ethnographical Waldensian Museum in Colonia Valdense, which includes the origin of the Waldensian history as much as the history of the migration and the South American colonies. South American Waldensian communities also celebrate many traditional Waldensian feasts, such as the 17th of February, when King Charles Albert granted civil rights to the Waldenses of the Valleys in 1848. But in some cases, the Waldensian tradition merged with other Protestant traditions. This is the case of the Fiesta de la Cosecha, sometimes called the Fiesta de la Gratitud, that is a harvest festival when the families of the rural communities donate to the local church some products of their crops, and the proceeds from the sale go to the same church. Usually there is also a Thanksgiving worship and a community lunch. The celebration began to take place from the 20s from a proposal of Daniel Breeze, an English Methodist pastor that at that time took care of the Waldensian community of Ombues de la Valle. Okay. This occasion is really interesting because it combines many different traditions and shows how heritage could be dynamic. Waldensian heritage is made of negotiations, of dialogues, and exchanges that are particularly evident within the migratory context. And if there is time, a last element I wanted to highlight is the return visits. There are always many exchanges of people between the Iglesia Valdense Rioplatense and the Waldensian Italian Church, and I focused on three kinds of return visit in particular. One is a project called Los Peregrinos that began in 1956 and consisted in a travel that was organized every year and involved a large group of Uruguayan and Argentinian Waldenses that visited the Waldensian valleys and the places of origin of their ancestors. And this project ended in 1989 because of financial problems. Another form of return visit is the youth exchanges that have been officially promoted by the Waldensian Synod in 2011, but they already existed before. And the last form of return I investigated is a particular one and consists in the return migration of some descendants of the Waldenses migrated to South America. After the economic crisis of 2001, many people addressed to the Waldensian archive in the Waldensian valleys to do genealogical researches and get information to request dual citizenship, yes. During my stay in South America, I discovered that many members of the South American Waldensian Church have a relative who migrated back to the valleys, but I also discovered that the main reason for this return is because they married a Waldensian partner, met on the occasion of a church exchange. So the crisis was not the primary motivation, and the maintenance of the links between the two churches has clearly affected this phenomenon. I wasn't able to go deep in this issue because of the nature of my investigation that consisted in a comparative research, but I think it would be interesting to go over in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess we still have time. So 10 minutes left for a discussion of these 4 interesting papers. May I suggest you to raise questions, raise your hand, please.
This is a question for Ms. Christensen. Could you tell us? Thank you. Could you tell us which are the aspects of Danish identity that younger people find less appealing, and which might be the reason why they turn their backs on that Danishness?
Any more questions?
I'm just wanting to know from you how the museum was set up and how it's sustained.
Okay. Any more questions? Moya? Professor Moya?
The question of what they find this not attractive about Danish culture, right? Because on the other hand, what do they find appealing about Danish culture? I don't know if they're aware that Danes are fashionable, Danes are hot, right? They're the happiest country in the world. They associate with great design, the highest ranked restaurant in anything that is trendy. The Danes seem to have, right? That is, but I don't know if Americans of Danish descent in Nebraska are aware of these images of Denmark as the super modern, super progressive, super.
Last question over there.
Time, sorry. Okay, but also a question to the colleague from Denmark, because you used a lot the word, the concept of assimilation, no, acculturation. Like I wanted to, I mean, I don't know if we have the time for theoretical scrutiny of terms from social sciences, but I rather regard assimilation and acculturation as really like old-fashioned models of migration research. If you are critical in your work, like theoretically and practically, with this really interesting project that you're doing on the Danish Migration Museum. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to try and keep all of your questions in mind when I answer now. But first of all, it might be important to say that I didn't go about judging what is Danish and what is not. So I don't take a stance on what I perceive as being Danish and what I don't. What I paid attention to was whether the people that I spoke to perceived themselves to be Danish. So spoke of themselves as being Danish and practiced what they found to be Danish. So I know that the Danishness practiced over there may not exactly resemble Danishness as people in Denmark today would understand it. But I sort of let people for themselves decide what they perceive to be Danish or not. About the attractiveness of being Danish and also with young people and what you also mentioned, I definitely found a sincere pride among my informants, many of my informants, about being Danish, having Danish blood. Many were very concerned with, particularly the older generations, whether or not they were 100% Danish or not, which sort of is sort of, I guess, a bit of a racial way of viewing being Danish, because you're related to your blood, so that you can also, speak of, well, what is Danish? Is that having Danish blood in your veins, or is it perceiving yourself to be Danish, or whatever? But they did have this grand narrative of what was Danish. So they would mention the happiest people in the world, a country of solidarity in the welfare system, a Scandinavian design, and so forth and so on. Yeah. So many would, especially the older generations, mention these things. About the younger generation, I'm not sure that they didn't find Danish identity appealing, more so than I think it didn't come to play a big part of what they found important. They increasingly moved to the bigger cities, so there would also be an increasing line of intermarriage. They would have spouses who was of another ethnic origin, and they would have to sort of negotiate within the family also what to transmit to their kids and so forth. So I'm not sure that it was actually a matter of them not finding it appealing, more so that it is a product of moving away of more lines of mixed marriages and so forth. But that is not to say that I'm not sure it's going to disappear. I think there are examples in history that ethnicity can come to have sort of a revival. So we'll see about that. Okay. Final question down there: acculturation. I've used researchers who consider acculturation to be a matter of, first, the extent to which you want to maintain your culture and identity, and second, the extent to which you want to sort of have a relation to the broader society, including other ethnic groups. And I guess assimilation, as you say, would be to not want to have much to do with your culture and traditions, to want to be emerged into the broader society. So is that an answer that is good enough, or? Okay, good.
Last question.
Was there a question for another one as well? Free.
For you. All right.
I asked you about the museum.
Okay, yes. Sorry, I didn't understand. Yes. Yes, there is a historic and ethnographical museum, and this is typical of the Waldensian groups of the Waldensian descendants I investigated. For example, there is also a Waldensian museum in North America, or there are many Waldensian museums. Who funds? Yes. Okay. Okay. Sorry. It is in this case in South America. It is funded from the church. And the church sometimes is funded from some funds that come from Italy, from the Italian church, because yes, there is there are always many exchanges between the two churches. And in that time, the Waldensian Italian Church sent many funds to the South American Waldensian Church.
Okay, it's 6:45. I think we are 15 minutes away. I think it's time to finish this very intense and thought-provoking session. I thank all speakers and all participants for their presence here, and we're going to meet tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Chairman will be Professor Jose Moya. The next session will be is entitled Transculturalism and Hybridization. So now Santiago is yours. Enjoy this sunny afternoon and this fantastic evening. Thank you very much.